day, everyone. I'm sure that comments. I must say that it's my most special honor as one of the speakers for this year's St. Thomas Aquinas. 10 years ago, in 2012, I was invited by the then Dean of Studies, Father Dr. Victor Emmanuel Aureliana, to speak during a seminary symposium. And I remember with fondness my excitement to speak in a philosophical lecture for the first time in my college alma mater, the Rogationist College Seminary. It was a surreal moment for me back then, as I remember how I, as a young college student, would eagerly look forward to the yearly celebration of the Feast of the Angelic Doctor as a special moment where we get the chance to learn more about philosophy. This excitement in me has not changed. Fast forward to today, however, I also look back with nostalgia, remembering the many people I encountered along the way, so that I may have the competence and the courage to speak before you today. I recall with deep gratitude my most brilliant professors, Dr. Archimedes Flores, Father Bubutron Dael, Father Al Flores, Father Herman Absede, Father General Nera, Father Danny Montana, Father Ed Fernandez, and the other professors who are still actively teaching until today here and elsewhere. In a very special way, I am more than happy to know that Mrs. Teresita Burgos is still actively teaching in the school, my Philippine teacher back then who gave me the lowest grade ever in my college life. Most importantly, however, I remember with gratitude my professors, Mrs. Sandra Arroyo, Dr. Vida Madrigal, Dr. Wong, Dr. Antonio Pinion, and others who have all gone ahead of us. I wish to honor their memory by taking this lecture as a homecoming, an event which will serve as a starting point for my sharing today. So the opportunity to speak before you in a philosophical lecture during the time of a pandemic about COVID-19 and all crazy ideas about deconstruction implies a culmination of the ironies that are presently inframing our modern technological life. Indeed, if it's possible to speak of COVID-19 and deconstruction as I was asked to do, and to perform a deconstruction worthy of its name, it is imperative to return to the essential motivation of why we must deconstruct the pandemic in the first place. But this image of return allows us to understand that the physical movement whereby a thing is allowed to reach its previous originary position is no longer the same and absolutely commensurate to itself. The wheel, for instance, in its turning is only ever allowed to turn over or to revolve itself in an advanced position within a given spatial and temporal succession. To turn a wheel over and over, or to return a thing, an event, or even a person can thus happen only within a cyclic process that continually returns to oneself while never remaining the same, because one is inescapably changed by the very process of turning. Thus, we have wheels, screws, balls, and planets, whose revolutions along their orbits account for years and years, whereby time is variably constituted as a spiral that returns to itself while no longer staying as itself, being forwarded and changed at the same time. It is in this that this lecture is a homecoming, a return to the same and familiar, while never remaining the same and before, in the hope that something new has come or has arrived. In this short sharing, then, I wish to discuss the thesis that deconstruction is a kind of return, a homecoming, which can be understood in terms of the following elements, namely, first, in terms of justice as its originary motivation, second, as something that is performed, and lastly, as a philosophical attitude. Within the context of the topic given to me, that is about the current pandemic and its relationship to deconstruction, and given the limits of time, I am afraid, however, that we can only go into a very preliminary discussion of these concepts.
I hope, though, that they may spur the curiosities of many of our students today. Given our present time, the rise of academic scholarship and the implements of technology and education, we are already at a better position now to understand and what Jacques Derrida has come to mean by his celebrated thinking about deconstruction. It is about justice. Deconstruction, if such a thing exists, is justice. So he says in an interview with Lucila Cornell during a symposium at the Cardozo Law School way back in the 90s. Although the initial understanding of deconstruction as Derrida would practice it way back in the 60s and the 70s had been initially confined to mostly US literature departments as a kind of textual strategy, the more obvious engagement by Derrida with the thought of Karl Marx in his controversial book entitled Spectres of Marx in 1991 has definitely reconfirmed the nature of deconstruction as a deeply political enterprise. So if the question is asked about what is the fuzz about deconstruction, then one may correctly answer that it is about justice. Justice is the point why one must and does deconstruct. The only complicated thing that we need to do here is how we may elaborate about this thesis. Derrida's vast range of topics from metaphysics to epistemology to questions of language, culture, aesthetics, politics, and ethics demands that one must have a working knowledge of many thinkers in the classical philosophical tradition so as to be able to make sense of his writings. And so he discusses Plato, Augustine, Descartes, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Marx, Husserl, Freud, Heidegger, Saussure, Foucault, Barthes, Levinas, and many others to include even those in the analytic tradition such as J.L. Austin and John Searle. To be more precise, however, to understand this deconstructive obsession with justice demands a return to the thought of Martin Heidegger and Emmanuel Levinas. First, it must be emphasized that Derrida's practice of deconstruction was an attempt to appropriate the Heideggerian concepts of destruction, or non-negative destructuring and upbow, demolition or dismantling, which in the context of the overcoming or the transformational recovery of metaphysics, have instead signified a more positive process that aims at the retrieval of a more authentic experience of being. In the context of this critique or even death of metaphysics, Derrida sought to practice deconstruction not only as a novel and responsible way of reading texts, but as a way out of the limits of a metaphysics tied up with the stringent and alienating effects of technological modernity. Derrida does this by demonstrating that any metaphysics which relies on the priority of presence, that is, on the priority of the now or of the actual, will only install the human subject and her presence as the absolute criteria for validating truth, meaning, power, and eventually the violence necessarily connected with the possession of power. A system codified as logocentrism, that is, the view that meaning is ultimately reducible to a transcendental signified, such as a logos, cogitus, spirit, etc., and its attendant phonocentrism, that is the view that speech communicates meaning more authentically than writing. The world by which we can mean here the totality of beings determined in relation to the human subject would thus be at the mercy of the human being, who as the being present in the world can appropriate power in any way that she pleases. This is also the conception of the world, which is referentially equivalent to both nature and the earth as a planet, as a mere resource which in Heideggerian language is termed as a standing reserve, or what we call as Bestand. Here, the fate of the word as Bestand exemplifies the reign of objectifying and instrumentalist thinking that is eventually concretized in the manifold forms of objectification, alienation, dehumanization, oppression, and suffering of many of the world's poor and marginalized today. Given the above, it should therefore be clear at this point that Derrida's political concerns are underlined by the ethical as its primary motor. The second element that needs to be unpacked in this regard recalls the definition of justice as the relation to the other. Following Emmanuel Levinas' phenomenological reconstruction of subjectivity as the essential responsibility for the other, Derrida claims that the metaphysics of the subject, which had hitherto been reduced into a metaphysics of power attributed to a subject, is itself subject to the rupture occasioned by the coming of the other. This means that the power and privilege of the subject cannot only be self-referential, but rather, following the logic of alterity or difference exemplified by Levinas, is essentially constituted by the effects itself of the play or movement of difference. Now, difference itself is a neologism coined by Derrida to designate that movement of spacing and temporalizing that affects the production of differences within any given sign language considered as a sign system. While I cannot go into the intricate elaboration of this quasi-concept given the limits of time and the scope of this lecture, suffice it to say that the play of difference is what provided Derrida with a way out of the impasse occasioned by the closure of the metaphysics of presence. This can be illustrated by looking at the double bind in which Levinas has found himself in his attempt to think of the subject as an essential responsibility for the other. For Derrida, while Levinas' project is admirable as a radical rethinking or overcoming of the totalitarian tendencies of the whole philosophical tradition, it still falls squarely within the very same metaphysical tradition because we do not yet have the concepts or language which will enable us to get out of the pervasive effects of metaphysical violence. This belonging to the metaphysical tradition while attempting to rupture and get out of it illustrates a double bind in which Levinas finds himself. But by both belonging and not belonging, Derrida highlights the structural impossibility of remaining solely and beyond the metaphysical tradition. Such impossibility, however, leads us to posit a situation of undecidability where Levinas' ethical project is radically compromised. This moment of undecidability is what Derrida refers to as an aporia, that is, an impasse encountered by thinking beyond which it cannot anymore cross or proceed, where it cannot anymore proceed conceptually. Aporias are experiences which bring us to the limit of finite human knowing and allow us to recognize what is structurally beyond the possibility of metaphysical thinking. On this account, an aporia is a space where thinking is stymied because there are no longer any problems and objects can no longer be held conceptually. Nevertheless, this paralysis of thinking is something that amazes and calls us to respond. To encounter the aporia as an impossible crossing is to find oneself as called for by a duty, a command, or a demand to which we are captive. For Derrida, in a move that would try to save Levinas from himself, remarks that the way out of the aporia occasioned by the closure of metaphysics comes from the opening provided by that which exists in totality, an other to come that cannot be contained within the limits of presence because it comes from an opening provided by the future. This other is the radical alterity that we must meet with justice in a relation that must allow the other to be as she is. This other as that which exceeds presence, thought, and language is the one that we must meet in justice beyond all the constructions that limit us into the pervasive and dominant forms of thinking such as we find in Eurocentrism, ethnocentrism, patriotism, nationalism, and other isms that condition humanity into subservient forms of thinking, not only in the past, but more importantly, even in the present. Contrary then to the claim that the construction is an enclosure in nothingness, Derrida offers the construction as a way out of this enclosure within linguistic subjectivism and theoretical solidification. This is why we must also conceive of deconstruction as a return to the singular, unique, concrete experience of human beings beyond the biases and prejudices occasioned by the manifold technologies around us. At this point, I would like to zero in on the characterization of deconstruction as a practice of reading texts. Here I follow Simon Critchley's idea of double reading as a heuristic device in presenting deconstruction as something that happens within texts. Accordingly, deconstruction is something that takes place in a text, as in a text that loses its own construction so as to open itself to a multiplicity of meanings. For Critchley, what is first involved in this process is to provide a patient, rigorous, and scholarly reconstruction of a text as a powerful primary layer of reading that remains faithful to original context of the text and intention of the author in the form of dominant commentary. From this first layer of reading, a second moment of reading is opened up by interpretation, where the text's intended meaning is purportedly contradicted by certain blind spots in the text. This opens up the text into a multiplicity of meanings other than that sanctioned by authorial intent. But this rupture is something that is sanctioned from within the text itself rather than imposed from the outside. This is opening up from within the text itself, which characterizes the constructive reading as parasitic. The reader must both draw their sustenance from the host text and lay their critical eggs within its flesh. The construction then can be conceived as a subjectless process in the sense that the text deconstructs itself rather than being deconstructed. Within there, thus intention, a deconstructive reading, therefore, is an ambiguous gesture, since while it must necessarily carve itself out of a structuralist problematic, it nevertheless remains, more importantly, as an anti-structuralist gesture. Considering the construction as double reading, one can see that what Derrida philosophically exemplifies is a patient, meticulous, scrupulous, open, and questioning engagement with texts. This means that the activity called deconstruction is not some form of nihilistic textual free play that threatens to undermine our traditional values of rationality, morality, and other values of Western liberal democracy. Rather, it is a careful reading and thinking of text considered as an ethical demand. Deconstruction, in fact, as Critchley insightfully claims, is pedagogy, inasmuch as it teaches us to deal with text responsibly as a matter of justice. In this context, we can see that deconstruction as something that takes place within the text is itself the ethical gesture that lets the text be structurally open to the other. Here, the other must be understood as that which has always been appropriated and therefore neglected by the whole philosophical tradition. By opening a text to its other, the construction opens up the space for the possibility of justice. That is, the possibility of addressing that which tradition has always thought to be impossible as the not possible, beyond possible, beyond thought, language, presence. So the last point that I would like to discuss is about deconstruction as a philosophical attitude. Here, I must say, however, in a statement that will probably upset most of you, that there is nothing extraordinary about deconstruction as a philosophical way of looking at things. But there are certain markers that I would like to present to you as a way to guide our reflections in these most precarious of times, that is of the COVID-19 pandemic in the coming 2022 Philippine national elections. First, the construction is not a simple way of finding binaries such as good, evil, true, false, light, dark, etc., and then overturning them so that the secondary, often marginalized other becomes the now dominant term that will upset or overturn a given conceptual system. This practice, although not entirely wrong, would miss the ethical import of the construction as a whole. More than as a literary method or device, we must always remember that within their best intentions, the construction can never be used to favor a idea to marginalized evil in order to make it triumph over the true and the good. Second, we must also avoid thinking that the construction was only about showing that everything is a construct. Not everything is deconstructible, and this, according to Derrida, is justice. If everything would be deconstructible, then there would no longer be any point to deconstruction. And lastly, Deconstructive thinking can never be used to justify evil or any form of totalitarianism, at least in the mature thinking of Derrida. The deconstructive concern for justice renders it always on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized. This is why deconstruction can be a model for thinking how society must be reordered, even as it shares its most fundamental principles with Christianity. And so to end, I would like to say that deconstruction as a philosophical attitude lies in the openness that we have to the other of thinking or of philosophy. But this other is the impossible that we cannot totally capture within our reason, but towards which we must always wait in faith and justice. I will reserve a discussion of the possible deconstruction of St. Thomas given by the famous philosopher John Caputo for another lecture. But for now, on this feast of our patron saint, St. Thomas Aquinas, I wish to present him as what I think could be a model deconstructor, open, always looking at the many sides or aspects of a situation, and then giving his own unique answer to the problem at hand. In many ways, Jacques Derrida was like St. Thomas Aquinas in their search for truth, which is ultimately what goes beyond our reason and understanding. In what was to be the prime motive of their just thinking in order to uplift the plight of the poor, the oppressed, and the suffering, deconstruction might well be the modern version of the good news. And I end my lecture with this passage from the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus, the original deconstructor, announced, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed." Then he rolled up the scroll, turned it to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fixed on him. He began by saying, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled." And so with that, I end my lecture. If you have any questions, that you may just share. Thank you very much.